In the last module, we created our very first GraphQL schema. Like I said, a schema contains type definitions. GraphQL provides some built-in types such as query, mutation, and subscription, which defines the entry points for every GraphQL query. To start adding functionality to our GraphQL API, we need to define some custom types specifically for our project. These custom types are called object types. Just as our models, we will have user, thread, channel, reply, and favorite types. While it's perfectly fine to have the schema and resolvers in the index.js file, but this can easily become clumsy as the schema becomes large. Similarly, we can decide to put the schema and resolvers in their respective files. Again, for a large project, it might not be easy to maintain. So I prefer separating my schemas by their types as well as the resolvers. So let's create a new directory that will house all our type definitions. I'm going to call it type defs. And we'll start with the user type. So we'll create a user.js file. So first, we need to pull in GQL from Apollo server. Now we can make use of it. We will export the type definition. To define a type in GraphQL, we start with the keyword type, followed by the type name, which will be user in our case. Then the fields the type we have. So the user type will have an ID field. GraphQL schemas are strongly typed. Hence, all the fields defined in a schema must have return types. A field can either return a scalar type or another object type. By default, GraphQL comes with 5 scalar types out of the box, which are int, float, string, boolean, and ID. The ID field will be the type of an ID. And because the ID field will be required on the user type, we will add an exclamation mark at the end. Next, we define the username field, which will be a string, and again to be required. Then the email field, which will also be a string and required. Then the role field, which will be an enum called role. So we need to define that. An enum or enumeration type is a special kind of scalar type that is restricted to a particular set of allowed values. So to define an enum, we make use of the enum keyword, followed by the name of the enum, then the values the enum can have, in our case, which will be admin and user. We are defining the role field as an enum because we obviously want to restrict the values to admin and user. And this will be required as well. Next, we have the avatar field, which will be a string and can be nullable. Then lastly, we have the timestamps created at, which will be a string and required. Then updated at, which will also be a string and required. Next, let's create the channel type. Let's copy this. Then this will be channel. Then the ID field. A name field, which will return a string and required. Then a slug field, which will return a string and will be required. Then the timestamps. Next, let's create the thread type. I'm going to paste this in. type thread. It will have an ID field, a title field, which will be a string and required, a slug field, which will also be a string and required, then a content field, which will be a string and required, then a creator field, which will be the type of user, since the creator field will hold the details of the user that created the thread. Then a channel field, which will be the type of channel, since the field will contain details of the channel the thread belongs to. Then we have a status field, which will be an enum called thread status, and to be required. So let's create that. And the possible values will be unsolved and solved. Next, we have the isLogged field, which will be a boolean and required. Then a last replied at field, which will be a string and required. Then the timestamps. Next, let's create the reply type. Type reply. To have an ID field, a content field, which will be a string and required, a user field. This will be for the user that created the reply, so it will be the type of user. Then we have an isBestAnswer field, which will be boolean and it will be required. Then the timestamps. Lastly, we define the favorite type. This will only have two fields, which are user, for the user that made the favorite, which will be the user type, and it will be required. Then the reply the favorite is made on, which will be the reply type, and it will be required as well. Now we have all our types defined, but there is something we should be concerned with. Since each type definition file might have its own query, mutation, or subscription types, this will lead to multiple definitions of the built-in types, which will lead to an error, as GraphQL expects just one definition of each of the built-in types. To prevent this error, we need to define the built-in types once and extend them in our type definition files. So let's create a new file inside the type definitions directory. We'll call it root.js. I'm going to paste this. So type query, type mutation, and type subscription. Ideally, this is all we are expected to do, but as it stands, we can't define an empty type in GraphQL. So we need to use a kind of placeholder field to work around this, like this. Then we'll do the same thing here and here. Now we can extend these root types from any of our object type. So now we have each of our individual type definitions. What we need to do now is find a way to put them together. So I'm going to create an index file inside the types definition directory. And I'll pull in each of the type definition. This will be user, channel, thread, reply, and favorite. Then we will export an array containing each of the type. So now we can update the main index.js file. I'll get rid of this. Then pull in the type definition. And for the resolvers, we'll create resolvers directory that will contain an empty index.js file for now.